In the early morning hours over the Bismarck Sea, Japanese sailors aboard their convoy vessels had no reason to suspect that the rules of warfare were about to change forever beneath their feet. The date was March 1943, and the Pacific War had entered a phase where neither side could claim absolute dominance, though Japan still held vast territories and commanded respect through its naval prowess. What transpired in those waters would fundamentally alter how both sides understood aerial warfare against ships, and it would begin with a sound that no one had expected to hear coming from American bombers. The Japanese convoy moving through these contested waters represented a critical lifeline for imperial forces struggling to maintain their positions in New Guinea. Aboard 8 transport vessels, packed tightly with soldiers from the 51st Division, nearly 7,000 men travelled with the confidence that comes from being escorted by 8 destroyers of the Imperial Navy. These weren't green recruits or hastily assembled vessels. These were trained sailors manning ships equipped with anti-aircraft batteries that had been designed, tested, and proven in combat. The Japanese naval doctrine of creating an umbrella of steel through coordinated defensive fire had worked before. High-altitude American bombing runs had consistently failed to achieve significant results against moving naval targets. The bombs simply couldn't hit with enough precision when dropped from thousands of feet above. Torpedo attacks, while potentially more effective, required long approach runs that left the attacking aircraft exposed to defensive fire for extended periods. Time and again, Japanese convoys had weathered these assaults. The troops aboard the transports were desperately needed at Leh, where Japanese forces were running dangerously low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Without these reinforcements, the entire position risked collapse, which would open a clear path for Allied forces advancing through New Guinea. The mission was vital, but it wasn't seen as particularly dangerous by those who planned it. After all, they had done this before. Ships had made similar runs and survived. The combination of destroyer escorts, fighter cover when available, and the proven effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire provided multiple layers of protection. Japanese officers who studied American air tactics had concluded that the Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific lacked the capability to seriously threaten well-defended convoys. The Americans had proven themselves mediocre at high-altitude bombing against ships, and they didn't possess the naval aviation expertise that would be required for effective torpedo attacks. What those Japanese planners didn't know, couldn't have known, was that thousands of miles away in Australia, an entirely new type of weapon had been taking shape. The transformation hadn't occurred in a factory or a research laboratory. It had happened in the practical, improvised environment of a field workshop, where necessity drove innovation faster than any formal development program ever could. An American officer named Paul Gunn, known to most as Pappy, had looked at the fundamental problem facing Allied air forces and decided that the solution required throwing out the conventional wisdom entirely. Gunn wasn't a traditional military thinker. His background included time in the Navy before he transitioned to civilian aviation, and when war came, he found himself in the Army Air Forces, bringing a perspective shaped by practical experience rather than doctrine. The B-25 Mitchell was a capable medium bomber, but it wasn't particularly effective against ships when used in its standard configuration. High-altitude bombing had failed repeatedly. The accuracy just wasn't there. A ship could maneuver, and bombs took time to fall, and the combination meant that most attacks resulted in near misses at best. Gunn understood that if you wanted to hit a ship reliably, you needed to get close. Very close. Close enough that evasive maneuvers wouldn't matter. Close enough that the time between bomb release and impact was measured in seconds, not the long, arcing fall from high altitude. But getting that close meant flying straight into the teeth of defensive fire, and that's where Gunn's radical modification came into play. If you were going to fly right at a ship, you needed a way to suppress its defenses first. You needed to silence those anti-aircraft guns before they could shoot you down. At Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Gunn and a small team of mechanics began removing the glass nose sections from B-25 bombers. In their place, they installed something unprecedented: multiple forward-firing Browning .50 caliber machine guns. The first attempts used 4 guns, but as they refined the concept and solved the engineering challenges, they increased it to 8. 8 heavy machine guns, all pointing forward, all capable of firing simultaneously. The mechanical challenges were significant. The recoil forces from 8 50 caliber guns firing at once were enormous. The nose structure had to be reinforced to handle the stress. Ammunition feeds had to be reliable even during violent maneuvers. The weight distribution of the aircraft changed, affecting its flight characteristics. Each problem was solved through trial and error, through the practical knowledge of mechanics who understood that there was no time for lengthy development programs. What emerged from those modifications was something entirely new in aerial warfare. A 50 caliber machine gun fires a projectile that weighs about 2 ounces and travels at nearly 3,000 feet per second. One gun can fire roughly 700 rounds per minute. 8 guns working together could pour out almost 7,000 rounds every 60 seconds. The ammunition they used included armor-piercing incendiary rounds designed to penetrate steel and then ignite whatever was behind it. When 8 of these weapons fired in unison, they created a stream of metal so dense that it could soar through ship superstructures, shred gun crews, tear apart bridge equipment, and turn open decks into killing zones. The visual effect, as later described by those who witnessed it, resembled 8 separate streams of fire merging into a single wall of destruction emanating from the bomber's nose. But the gun modification was only half of the innovation. The second element came from a bombing technique that had been developed independently by other American pilots struggling with the same fundamental problem of how to hit ships reliably. Major William Benn and pilots of the 43rd Bombardment Group had been experimenting with an approach that seemed almost suicidal at first glance, flying at wave-top height and releasing bombs so that they would skip across the water surface like stones thrown across a pond. The physics of it made sense. A bomb released at extremely low altitude, travelling forward at the aircraft's speed, would strike the water at a shallow angle and ricochet forward. If the timing and angle were right, that bomb would skip 1 or more times before slamming into the side of a ship at or near the waterline. The accuracy was dramatically better than high-altitude bombing because the release point was so much closer to the target, and the bomb's trajectory was nearly horizontal rather than a long, arcing fall. The technique required extraordinary skill and courage. Pilots had to fly straight toward their target, maintaining a steady course at altitudes measured in tens of feet above the water, close enough that they could see individual faces on ship decks. They had to hold that course even as defensive fire reached out toward them, even as every instinct screamed to take evasive action. The run had to be straight, steady, and timed with precision. Too high and the bomb wouldn't skip properly. Too low and you risked hitting the water yourself. Release too early and the bomb would fall short. Release too late and you'd fly directly over the target before the bomb reached it. Pilots practiced for weeks against a rusting hulk in Australian waters, a derelict vessel named the SS Pruth that became their training target. They flew approach after approach, learning to judge distance, timing, and angle until the technique became instinctive. When General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, saw these 2 innovations combined, he immediately grasped their potential. The Strafer configuration would suppress defensive fire. The skip bombing technique would deliver the actual killing blow. Together, they transformed the B-25 from a medium bomber of limited effectiveness against ships into what Kenney described as a commerce destroyer capable of annihilating convoys. Orders went out to convert more aircraft. Training intensified. By early 1943, entire squadrons had been modified and their crews drilled in the new tactics. Australian units flying Bow fighters were incorporated into the attack plans, their own heavy forward-firing armament adding to the suppressive fire that would precede the actual bombing runs. The Japanese convoy, unaware of these developments, continued its journey toward Lae with confidence born of experience and doctrine. On the morning of March 3, 1943, lookouts scanning the horizon saw what they expected to see: American aircraft approaching at altitude. Alarms sounded across the convoy. Gun crews rushed to their positions. Barrels swung skyward. The umbrella of steel began to form, shells bursting in the sky above, creating a defensive barrier that had worked before. Some B-17 flying fortresses and B-25s at conventional altitude did approach, exactly as Japanese doctrine predicted. Gunners tracked them, fired at them, forced them to maintain distance. Everything was proceeding according to expectations and experience. Then something changed. A different sound reached the ears of those on deck, deeper, closer, rising not from the sky above, but from the surface of the sea itself. Pilots of the 3rd Attack Group, along with their Australian counterparts, had approached at an altitude so low that the curvature of the earth and the visual clutter of the ocean surface had hidden them until they were almost upon the convoy. They came in fast, their engines straining, propellers churning through the spray kicked up by flying just feet above the waves. The Japanese sailors who first spotted them had only seconds to process what they were seeing. These weren't bombers approaching for a high-altitude run or torpedo planes setting up their attack pattern. These were aircraft coming straight at them, level with the waterline, and from their noses protruded multiple dark barrels. Major Edward Lana's aircraft reached effective range first. At 1,200 yards, a distance at which individual details of the destroyer Shirayuki were clearly visible, Lana pressed his firing triggers. 850 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The physical effect was immediate and catastrophic. Tracer rounds, glowing bright even in daylight, formed visible lines between the aircraft and its target. Where those lines touched the ship, steel tore open. Windows shattered, bridge structures disintegrated. Gun crews trying to bring their weapons to bear simply ceased to exist, swept away by the density of fire. Shirayuki's bridge took the brunt of the first pass. In the span of perhaps 10 seconds, the ship's command structure was decapitated. Officers were killed at their posts. Communications equipment was destroyed. The destroyer, moments before a functioning warship, became a drifting hulk, her defensive capability eliminated before her guns could even train on the attackers. What followed was systematic destruction on a scale that defied the experience of everyone present. More strafers rolled in behind Lana. Lieutenant John Hennebree selected the transport Kyokusei Maru as his target. His 8 guns walked fire from the bow toward the stern, cutting through the bridge, killing everyone there, severing control systems. His bombs, released at the perfect moment, skipped once across the water and struck the hull below the waterline. The explosion tore open the ship's interior. Soldiers packed into the hold below decks had no warning, no chance. Water rushed in even as structural damage spread through bulkheads. The transport began listing immediately. Australian bow fighters joined the attack, their 20mm cannons adding to the suppressive fire. They targeted anti-aircraft positions, lifeboats, any point of resistance or potential escape. Their passes were lower than anyone had thought possible, their pilots showing the same aggressive courage that characterized the entire operation. Bombs continued to skip across the water, and the technique proved devastatingly effective. The destroyer Arashio attempted to maneuver between the attackers and the transports, trying to use her own hull as a shield. The decision was brave and entirely in line with naval tradition, but it sealed her fate. 3 strafers converged on her, their combined firepower overwhelming her defences. Her bridge was shredded. Her rudder mechanism was damaged. She lost steering control at the worst possible moment and drifted directly into the path of the transport Nojima. The 2 ships collided with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. Locked together, unable to separate, they became a single stationary target that ammunition fires spreading from one vessel to the other. Admiral Kimura watched his convoy disintegrate. His flagship was under attack, shells and bullets striking around him, his staff officers falling. He tried to issue orders, tried to coordinate some kind of response, but the situation had spiraled beyond any ability to control. Ships were burning, sinking, exploding. The carefully planned formation had collapsed into chaos. Destroyers that should have been protecting the transports were themselves crippled or sinking. The anti-aircraft fire, which should have created an impenetrable barrier, was being silenced by the very aircraft it was supposed to stop. The American tactics defied everything in Japanese naval doctrine. There were no torpedo runs to defend against, no high-altitude bombing to evade. Instead, the attackers came in at point-blank range, their weapons already firing before defensive measures could be effective. The transport Oigawa Maru tried to turn away, presenting her stern to the attackers in hopes of minimizing her profile. Instead, the maneuver exposed her entire length to raking fire. Streams of .50 caliber rounds chewed through her deck from bow to stern. One of the skip bombs struck perfectly, punching through the hull and detonating inside a cargo hold where fuel and munitions were stored. The explosion was massive enough to be felt on ships hundreds of yards away. Oigawa Maru didn't sink gradually. She was torn in two by the force of her own exploding cargo. The soldiers aboard her, roughly 1,000 men, simply vanished in fire and steam and falling debris. Survivors in the water watched pieces of the ship rain down around them. 15 minutes had passed since the first strafer opened fire. In those 15 minutes, an entire convoy had been destroyed. 4 transports were sinking or already sunk. The others were burning, crippled, clearly doomed. 4 destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The survivors were damaged, their crews decimated, their ability to fight effectively eliminated. Thousands of soldiers who had boarded those ships expecting to reinforce their comrades at Leh were now in the water, clinging to wreckage, struggling to stay afloat in oil-slicked seas. The mission that had begun with such confidence had become a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The Americans weren't finished. Orders had been given that no reinforcements should reach Leh, and those orders were followed to their logical and brutal conclusion. Aircraft circled back over the wreckage field. They strafed lifeboats. They fired into groups of survivors in the water. The justification was military necessity. Every soldier who reached shore might later fight against Allied forces. The reality was horror for those in the water, who watched streams of tracer fire approach across the waves, who saw rafts disintegrate and swimming men simply disappear beneath the surface. It was efficient. It was merciless. It ensured that of the nearly 7,000 men who had sailed with the convoy, fewer than 1,200 would ever reach land. On the surviving destroyers, the living moved among the dead. Decks were covered with bodies, with pieces of equipment torn loose by gunfire, with blood and oil and seawater. Bulkheads showed hundreds of bullet holes where .50 caliber rounds had punched through steel. Officers tried to organize damage control parties, tried to collect the wounded, tried to make sense of what had just happened. Admiral Kimura survived, though many around him had not. The flag he had sailed under was gone, torn away by gunfire or lost when part of the superstructure collapsed. His flagship was crippled. His convoy was destroyed. His mission had failed utterly. News of the disaster spread through the Imperial Navy with the speed that only catastrophic defeat can generate. Initial reports were met with disbelief. An entire convoy, 8 transports and 8 destroyers, destroyed in minutes. Impossible. But as more details came in, as survivors were questioned, as the few ships that managed to limp back to port told their stories, the truth became undeniable. American bombers had developed tactics against which Japanese defenses were helpless. The umbrella of steel doctrine, which had been taught as gospel, which had been validated through earlier successes, had failed completely against this new form of attack. Officers began reassessing everything they thought they knew about air defense. Flying at that altitude, attacking from that angle, with that much forward-firing armament combined with skip bombing, the Americans had found a weakness that no one had anticipated. Japanese naval architects had designed ships to defend against high-altitude bombing and torpedo attacks. Gun mounts were positioned for elevation. Training emphasized tracking aircraft at altitude or on long approach runs. Nobody had seriously considered massed low-altitude strafing attacks as a primary threat. The .50 caliber machine gun was known, but its effects when concentrated in groups of 8, firing continuously while the aircraft closed to point-blank range, exceeded anything that had been experienced before. For the Japanese forces at Leh, the convoy's destruction meant doom. The reinforcements weren't coming. The supplies weren't coming. They would have to hold with what they had, which wasn't enough. Ammunition would run out. Food would run out. Medical supplies would run out. The garrison would wither through attrition even if the Allies never launched a direct assault. Similar situations developed at other Japanese positions throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Daylight convoy operations in waters where Allied aircraft could reach became impossible. Ships had to travel at night, using darkness as their only defense, and even that wasn't always enough. Supply lines contracted. Garrisons became isolated. The slow strangulation of Japan's outer defensive perimeter had begun. Allied command celebrated the victory. Photographs of burning Japanese ships appeared in newspapers across America and Australia. The press called it a turning point, proof that American ingenuity and courage could overcome Japanese advantages. The Air Force promoted the success widely, partly for morale purposes, partly to validate the resources and support that had gone into developing these new tactics. Families of the air crews who had flown the mission received the news with relief and pride, knowing that their sons and husbands and brothers had struck a meaningful blow. But beyond the immediate tactical success, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented something more profound. It demonstrated that innovation could trump doctrine, that weapons designed for one purpose could be radically modified to serve another, and that the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom could produce results far beyond what traditional approaches achieved. Paul Gunn's field modifications, born from necessity and implemented with improvised tools, had created a weapon system that changed naval warfare. The concept of a heavily armed strafer attacking at low altitude became a template that would be refined and reused throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. Japanese naval doctrine, built on decades of tradition and experience, had proven inadequate against an adversary willing to innovate rapidly. The shock of the Bismarck Sea defeat rippled through the Imperial Navy's planning. Convoy operations were fundamentally reconsidered. Resources were diverted to night operations. New tactics were developed to counter low-altitude attacks, though none would prove as effective as simply avoiding daylight movement in contested waters. The psychological impact matched the material losses. Japanese sailors who had believed in their navy's superiority now had to confront the reality that American air power had found a way to destroy convoys with near impunity. The air crews who flew those missions paid a price for their success. Not all returned. Some aircraft were shot down by the defensive fire they were trying to suppress. Pilots who flew at wave-top height knew that any mechanical failure, any moment of inattention, could send them into the sea with no possibility of recovery. The men who survived carried memories of what they had done, of ships exploding beneath them, of water filled with dying men, of the choice to follow orders and strafe survivors. Some could talk about it easily, others never spoke of it. All of them understood that they had been part of something significant, a battle that would be studied and referenced for generations. The tactical innovations spread quickly. Other bomb groups adopted the strafer configuration. The skip bombing technique was refined further. Australian and New Zealand forces incorporated the lessons into their own operations. By mid-1943, Japanese ships throughout the Southwest Pacific faced an environment where daylight operations were suicidal. The stranglehold on supply lines tightened. Garrisons that had once been supplied regularly now went months without resupply. The cumulative effect was devastating to Japan's ability to defend its conquered territories. In later years, military historians would analyze the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a case study in innovation under pressure. The modifications that created the B-25 Strafer hadn't come from a research program or a design bureau. They came from field personnel who saw a problem and solved it with available resources. The skip bombing technique was developed through practical experimentation, not theoretical study. The combination of the two innovations created synergies that neither approach alone could have achieved. The Strafers suppressed defences, making the skip bombers more effective. The skip bombers delivered the killing blows that the Strafers alone couldn't achieve. Together, they were unstoppable. The lineage of the concept extended far beyond World War II. When American forces in Vietnam needed a way to provide sustained fire support, they created gunships by mounting multiple machine guns and cannons in the sides of cargo aircraft. The AC-47 Spooky, the AC-130 Spectre, these aircraft traced their conceptual ancestry directly back to Paul Gunn's modified B-25s. The idea of concentrating multiple weapons on a single platform, achieving such density of fire that defences were overwhelmed, proved to be endlessly adaptable. Different aircraft, different weapons, different targets, but the same underlying principle. Concentrated firepower delivered with precision overcomes defences built for conventional attacks. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed decades after World War II ended, embodied many of the same principles. A heavily armed aircraft designed to attack ground targets at low altitude, suppressing defences through sheer firepower while delivering precision weapons. The tactics might be more sophisticated, the technology far more advanced, but the conceptual foundation remained consistent with what had been proven in the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. For Japan, the defeat marked a clear point of decline. Subsequent attempts to resupply isolated garrisons met similar fates. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't unique, it was replicable. Allied forces used the same tactics again and again, each time achieving similar devastating results. Japanese logistics broke down. Soldiers at forward positions ran out of food and ammunition. Disease spread. Morale collapsed. Entire units ceased to be effective fighting forces not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't be supplied. The strategic impact of cutting supply lines proved as significant as any series of combat victories could have been. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese military leadership struggled to adapt. Some advocated for developing new fighter tactics, specifically to counter low-altitude attacks. Others pushed for redesigning ship defences to include more low-angle weapons. Resources were diverted to research programs exploring solutions. But the fundamental problem remained. Allied air superiority in the Southwest Pacific was growing, and no amount of tactical adjustment could overcome the basic reality that Japanese forces couldn't move supplies safely by sea during daylight. The war of attrition that followed favoured the side with more resources, better logistics, and the ability to innovate continuously. Japan couldn't match any of those advantages. The survivors of the convoy, those few who made it back to Japanese-controlled ports, told stories that spread through the fleet. They described the sound of 8 machine guns firing simultaneously, a roar unlike anything they had experienced. They described seeing the tracers forming solid lines of light, watching those lines tear through metal as if it were paper. They described the helplessness of being unable to return fire effectively because gun crews were being killed before they could aim. They described the bombs skipping across the water like stones, the impossibility of evading them because the release point was so close. These stories, told and retold, created a psychological barrier. Sailors knew what awaited them if they sailed into waters where American strafers operated. That knowledge affected morale, affected willingness to volunteer for convoy duty, affected the calculations of commanders planning operations. Allied intelligence learned of the impact through intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations. Japanese officers openly discussed the problem of the strafers. Some communications referred to them with terms that translated roughly as devil planes or fire demons. The psychological warfare value of these reactions wasn't lost on Allied command. If the enemy feared a particular weapon or tactic, it made sense to emphasize it, to ensure the enemy knew that the threat was present and unavoidable. Press releases highlighted the strafer operations. Captured Japanese documents were analysed for reactions and distributed to demonstrate enemy concerns. The technical evolution continued throughout 1943 and into 1944. gun packages were refined. Some B-25 variants eventually mounted up to 12 forward-firing 50-caliber guns, plus additional weapons in other positions. Ammunition types were optimized for anti-shipping work. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds proved most effective. Training programs incorporated lessons learned from each engagement. Pilots learned optimal approach angles, ideal release points for skip bombs, tactics for coordinating multiple aircraft in the same attack. What began as innovation became doctrine, then training standard, then simply the expected way of conducting anti-shipping operations. Japanese responses evolved as well, though never effectively enough to nullify the threat. Some ships received additional light anti-aircraft guns positioned to cover low angles of approach. Fighter patrols were tasked specifically with protecting convoys from low-altitude attack. Convoy routes were changed to maximize distance from Allied air bases. Operations were scheduled to take advantage of weather that would ground Allied aircraft. None of these measures restored the security that convoys had enjoyed before the Bismarck Sea. They merely reduced the certainty of destruction from absolute to very high probability. The human cost on both sides defied easy calculation. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the original battle and subsequent similar actions. Allied air crews were lost to accidents, mechanical failures, and defensive fire. Families on both sides received telegrams they dreaded. Communities mourned losses. The individuals behind the strategic calculations and tactical innovations were real people who died real deaths in cold water or burning aircraft, and no amount of historical analysis changes that fundamental truth. Yet, from a purely military perspective, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea achieved everything Allied planners could have hoped for. It destroyed an enemy convoy completely. It demonstrated the effectiveness of new tactics. It forced the enemy to abandon an entire class of operations. It isolated enemy garrisons and accelerated their collapse. It provided a template for future operations. It boosted Allied morale. It damaged enemy morale. By almost any measure, it represented a decisive victory with strategic implications far beyond the immediate loss of ships and men. The innovations that made the victory possible reflected broader patterns in how the United States approached warfare. American forces often compensated for lack of experience or initial disadvantages through rapid innovation and willingness to abandon failed approaches in favor of new ideas. The strafer modification and skip bombing technique weren't developed by high-level strategic planners or research institutions. They came from field-level personnel who had the authority and resources to experiment. That bottom-up innovation, supported by commanders willing to try unconventional approaches, proved to be a significant advantage throughout the war. General Kenny's role in recognizing and promoting the new tactics demonstrated the importance of leadership that could identify promising innovations and push for their adoption. Other commanders might have dismissed the strafer concept as too radical or too risky. Other generals might have insisted on continued attempts to make high-altitude bombing work despite its proven ineffectiveness. Kenny saw what Gunn and others had created, understood its potential, and moved quickly to implement it across his command. That decision-making speed, that willingness to embrace change, multiplied the impact of the original innovation. The battle also highlighted the importance of combined arms coordination. Australian Beaufighters worked alongside American B-25s. High-altitude bombers provided distraction while low-altitude strafers made their attack runs. Fighters provided escort and engaged enemy aircraft. Each element supported the others, and the combination proved more effective than any single approach could have been. This kind of coordination required effective communication, mutual trust between Allied forces, and careful planning. The success of the Bismarck Sea operation validated the time and effort invested in building those relationships and procedures. For the soldiers who died in the transports, for the sailors who drowned in oil-covered water, the strategic significance meant nothing. They experienced terror, pain, confusion, and death. Some died instantly, never knowing what hit them. Others lingered in the water for hours or days before succumbing to exposure or drowning. The survivors who made it back to Japanese lines carried physical and psychological scars. Many had watched friends die. All had experienced the helplessness of being under attack with no ability to fight back effectively. These individual experiences, multiplied across thousands of men, represented the human reality behind the dry language of after-action reports and casualty statistics. The Allied air crews had their own trauma to process. They had flown into walls of fire, seen aircraft around them explode or spiral into the sea, experienced the adrenaline and fear of combat at point-blank range. They had strafed lifeboats and swimming men, following orders but carrying the weight of those actions. Some of them would later question whether that final phase of the battle had been necessary or justified. Others accepted it as the grim necessity of war, where sentiment couldn't be allowed to undermine mission objectives. The psychological cost of victory isn't often discussed in histories focused on tactics and strategy, but it was real and significant. In the decades after the war, veterans from both sides occasionally met at reunions or historical conferences. Some Japanese survivors expressed respect for the skill and courage of the Allied air crews, even while acknowledging the terror those attacks had inspired. Some American pilots spoke of their respect for the Japanese sailors who had manned their guns until the end, fighting against impossible odds. These personal reconciliations never erased what had happened, but they added human dimension to events that could otherwise become abstracted into sterile discussions of tactics and technology. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains a subject of study in military academies and staff colleges. It appears in textbooks on air power, on innovation in warfare, on the Pacific Campaign. Analysts examine the decisions made by both sides, the technical developments that enabled the Allied victory, the failures of Japanese intelligence and doctrine that left their forces vulnerable. Each generation of military professionals extracts new lessons or finds contemporary relevance in events that occurred more than 8 decades ago. The fundamental lesson perhaps remains what it always was. Military advantage belongs to those who can adapt fastest to changing circumstances, who can identify and exploit enemy weaknesses, who can innovate under pressure, and who can implement new ideas before the enemy can counter them. Japan entered the war with significant advantages in experience, equipment quality, and tactical sophistication. The United States overcame those advantages through industrial capacity, yes, but also through exactly the kind of rapid innovation that the Strafer development represented. The ability to look at a problem, develop a solution, test it, refine it, and deploy it in a matter of months gave Allied forces a decisive edge that Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on established doctrine and hierarchical decision-making, couldn't match. The story of the Bismarck Sea is ultimately a story about change, about how warfare evolves, about how certainty becomes vulnerability when the assumptions underlying that certainty prove false. The Japanese convoy sailed into those waters carrying the confidence of doctrine and experience. The ships were properly defended. The tactics were sound according to established principles. Everything had been done correctly according to how naval operations were supposed to work. And none of it mattered, because the rules had changed and nobody had told them. The 8-gun noses of the B-25 Strafers represented a new reality, one that rendered previous doctrine obsolete in the span of 15 minutes. That's how quickly war can change, how quickly advantage can shift, how quickly yesterday's strength becomes today's weakness when someone thinks differently about how to use the tools available to them.